was a crisp evening at one of the most luxurious hotels in the city, a place where sophistication and guest satisfaction were supposed to be the top priorities. The lobby gleamed with polished marble floors and chandeliers, creating an atmosphere that exuded exclusivity and high-class service. Henry Bennett, a well-dressed man in his late 50s, walked in quietly. Wearing a casual outfit topped with a bright red MAGA hat, he blended in like any other traveler. What no one realized was that Henry wasn't just any guest. He was the owner of this prestigious hotel chain, deciding to make an unannounced visit to check on his staff and see how the business was running when no one knew he was around. As Henry approached the front desk, he was met by a frown from the receptionist, Julia Taylor. Her gaze landed on his hat, and a look of disdain immediately crossed her face. What should have been a smooth check-in took an unexpected turn as Julia, visibly irked by the political symbol, decided to deny Henry service. The situation escalated quickly when the manager, Carl Dawson, got involved and supported her decision. Security was called and Henry was escorted out, all while he maintained his composure, hinting that this wasn't the last they'd see of him. Little did Julia and Carl know, the man they had just humiliated wasn't just an ordinary guest. He was their boss. And soon, they would learn a lesson they would never forget. Before we dive into the shocking story of arrogance, consequences, and redemption, make sure to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts on what you would do in Henry's shoes. Henry Bennett had always preferred to keep a low profile when visiting his properties. Despite his success as the owner of a renowned chain of luxury hotels, he never liked flaunting his wealth or authority. It was important to him that his business was run with a genuine focus on customer satisfaction, and that meant observing his staff when they had no idea he was around. That day, he had chosen to visit one of his properties unannounced, dressed casually in jeans, a simple jacket, and a red MAGA hat that he often wore, much to the dismay of those who didn't share his views. The hat was a symbol of his beliefs, but it wasn't something he used to provoke anyone. It was simply part of who he was. The lobby of the hotel was bustling with activity. Guests were checking in and out, luggage was being wheeled across the marble floor, and the elegant chandeliers above bathed the room in a warm glow. Henry walked in, taking in the sight with pride. This was one of his favorite properties, known for its exquisite service and attention to detail. He had worked hard to build this hotel chain from the ground up, and he was proud of what it had become. Approaching the front desk, Henry gave the receptionist, Julia Taylor, a warm smile. Julia was in her late 20s, with an air of confidence that bordered on arrogance. She was efficient at her job, but she was also quick to judge, and her biases often influenced her interactions with guests. As Henry stepped forward, she glanced up from her computer, her eyes immediately locking onto the bright red hat he wore. Her expression shifted from professional neutrality to thinly veiled disdain. "Good evening," Henry said politely. "I have a reservation under the name Bennett." Julia's eyes narrowed slightly as she took in the hat, her lips pressing into a thin line. "I'm sorry, sir," she said, her tone dripping with condescension, "but we reserve the right to refuse service to anyone promoting divisive symbols." Henry raised an eyebrow, taken aback. He had not expected this. "I'm sorry, what?" he asked, keeping his tone calm. "I just need my room key. I'm not here to discuss politics." Julia folded her arms across her chest, her expression hardening. "I'm afraid I can't check you in," she said firmly. "You'll have to leave." Henry took a deep breath, trying to keep his composure. He had dealt with difficult situations before, but this was different. This was his own hotel, and he was being refused service because of a hat. "Is there a manager I can speak to?" he asked, his voice still calm, but with an edge of frustration. Julia hesitated for a moment before picking up the phone and calling for the manager on duty. A few minutes later, Carl Dawson arrived. Carl was in his early 40s, a man who had been with the company for several years. He was known for being easygoing, often to the point of complacency. He rarely challenged his staff, preferring to avoid confrontation whenever possible. "What seems to be the problem here?" Carl asked, looking between Julia and Henry. Julia quickly spoke up, her tone defensive. "This gentleman is wearing a MAGA hat, and I informed him that we cannot check him in. It's against our policy to allow symbols that could make other guests uncomfortable." Carl glanced at Henry, his eyes briefly flicking to the hat before he gave a small dismissive shrug. "I'm afraid she's right, sir," he said. "We're here to create a comfortable environment for all our guests, and that hat could be seen as offensive. If right, we reserve the right to deny service at our discretion." Henry felt a surge of frustration, but kept his expression neutral. He could see that neither Julia nor Carl had any interest in de-escalating the situation or treating him fairly. "Are you seriously refusing me service because of a hat?" he asked, his voice calm but carrying a note of incredulity. Carl nodded, his expression indifferent. "We have to think about the comfort of all our guests," he said. "If you're unwilling to comply, we'll have to ask you to leave." Henry looked at both of them for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "You might want to think carefully about this decision," he said, his tone even. There was no anger in his voice, just a quiet authority that neither Julia nor Carl seemed to notice. Julia scoffed, clearly unbothered. "Security will escort you out if you don't leave on your own," she said, her tone dripping with impatience. Henry didn't argue. He simply turned and began to walk toward the exit, his posture relaxed, his expression calm. As he reached the door, he glanced back at Julia and Carl, giving them a small, knowing smile. "I assure you, this isn't over," he said, his voice carrying just enough weight to hint at the consequences to come. Moments later, 2 security guards approached, and Henry allowed them to escort him out of the building without protest. He wasn't angry. He was disappointed. Disappointed that his own staff, people he trusted to uphold the values of his business, had treated him and potentially other guests this way. But he also knew that this was an opportunity to make things right, to ensure that his hotels were places where all guests were treated with respect, regardless of their personal beliefs. As Henry walked to his car, he took out his phone and scrolled through his contacts. It was time to make a call that would change everything for Julia and Carl. They had no idea who they had just thrown out, but they were about to find out in a way they would never forget. Sitting in his car, Henry took a moment to compose himself before dialing Sarah Matthews, the regional general manager who oversaw several of the company's properties, including this one. Sarah had been with the company for years, and Henry trusted her judgment implicitly. She answered on the second ring, her tone warm but professional. "Henry, what a surprise," she said. "How can I help you?" Henry let out a small sigh. "Sarah, we have a serious problem at the downtown hotel," he said, his voice steady. "I was just refused service and escorted out by security because of a hat I was wearing." There was a pause on the other end of the line, followed by a shocked, "What? Are you serious? Who did this?" "The front desk clerk and the manager on duty," Henry replied. "They made it very clear that my hat was not welcome and that they wouldn't be checking me in. I need you to address this first thing tomorrow morning. I'll be in my office, and we need to have a serious discussion about how this was allowed to happen." Sarah's voice was filled with disbelief and concern. "Absolutely, Henry. I'm so sorry this happened. I'll take care of it immediately. We'll get to the bottom of this." The next morning, Sarah Matthews arrived at the hotel earlier than usual, her expression set in a determined line. She had spent the night replaying Henry's words in her head, struggling to understand how her staff could have treated the owner of the company with such disrespect. She knew that this was going to be a difficult day, but she was determined to handle it with the professionalism that Henry expected. Sarah wasted no time in calling both Julia and Carl into the conference room. The 2 employees arrived, their expressions confused but unconcerned. Carl offered a polite smile, while Julia looked slightly annoyed, as if her time were being wasted. Sarah gestured for them to sit, her demeanor cold and authoritative. "Do either of you know why I've called you here this morning?" Sarah began, her tone sharp. Julia glanced at Carl, then shook her head. "No, I don't," she said. "Is there an issue with the front desk?" Sarah took a deep breath, her eyes narrowing. "Oh, there's an issue, all right. The issue is that you both decided to throw out a guest last night, one who had a valid reservation, simply because he was wearing a hat that you personally didn't like." Julia's expression hardened, and she crossed her arms over her chest. "That hat was a MAGA hat," she said defensively. "It's divisive, and we have the right to refuse service to anyone who makes our guests uncomfortable." Sarah's eyes flashed with anger. "Do you have any idea who you threw out last night?" she demanded. Carl shifted uncomfortably in his seat, a sense of unease beginning to creep over him. "No, we don't," he said slowly. "He didn't mention anything about who he was." Sarah leaned forward, her voice low and cold. "That man was Henry Bennett, the owner of this hotel, the man who signs your paychecks." Both Julia and Carl's faces went pale. Julia's mouth opened and closed wordlessly, while Carl's eyes widened in shock. The room was silent for a moment, the weight of Sarah's words sinking in. "He's furious," Sarah continued, her tone unrelenting. "And frankly, I don't blame him. The 2 of you treated him with complete disrespect, all because of a hat. This isn't about politics. This is about professionalism, about treating every guest with dignity, regardless of your personal feelings. You both failed to do that. Julia's voice was shaky as she tried to defend herself. I thought I was doing the right thing. I didn't want other guests to feel uncomfortable. Sarah shook her head, her expression one of disappointment. You thought wrong. This is a luxury hotel. Our job is to provide excellent service to every guest who walks through those doors, not to judge them based on their clothing or their beliefs. You both made a huge mistake, and now you're going to have to answer for it. Later that morning, Sarah arranged a meeting with Henry in his office at the hotel. She brought Julia and Carl along, knowing that they needed to face the man they had wronged. The atmosphere in the office was tense as they entered, Julia and Carl both looking nervous and unsure of what to expect. Henry sat behind his desk, his expression calm but stern. Good morning, Henry said, his voice steady as he looked at the two employees who had refused him service the night before. I understand you know who I am now. Julia swallowed hard, nodding. Yes, sir. We're very sorry, she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. Henry held up a hand, silencing her. Let me make something clear, he said, his tone firm. This isn't about politics. This isn't about a hat. This is about respect. Something that every guest who walks through the doors of this hotel deserves. You made an assumption about me based on a piece of clothing, and that's not just unprofessional, it's unacceptable. Carl nodded, his face flushed with embarrassment. I understand, Mr. Bennett, he said quietly. We should have handled the situation differently. I take full responsibility for my actions. Henry's gaze shifted between the two, his expression unwavering. You both need to understand that this hotel, and every hotel in my chain, stands for professionalism and respect. I built this business from the ground up, with a focus on treating every guest with dignity, no matter who they are or what they believe. What you did was a betrayal of everything we stand for. Julia nodded, tears beginning to well up in her eyes. I understand, sir. I truly am sorry. I didn't mean to cause any harm. Henry took a deep breath, leaning back in his chair. I appreciate that you're apologizing now, but actions have consequences. I need you both to understand that what happened last night cannot happen again, to anyone. We'll be discussing those consequences shortly, but for now, I want you to reflect on how your behavior reflects not only on you as individuals, but on this entire company. The room fell silent as Henry's words hung in the air, the gravity of the situation weighing heavily on Julia and Carl. They had made a terrible mistake, and now they would have to face the repercussions. Sarah watched the exchange, her expression unreadable, but her thoughts clear. This was a moment that neither Julia nor Carl would soon forget. The atmosphere in the office was tense as Henry's words lingered in the air. Julia and Carl sat there, the weight of their actions pressing heavily on their shoulders. Henry had made it clear that their behavior was not only unprofessional, but a complete betrayal of the values upon which his company was built. Both employees knew that this was not something they could just walk away from without consequences. Henry took a deep breath, his expression softening slightly, though the firmness in his voice remained. Sarah, I trust you to handle this from here. I'll leave it in your hands to determine the appropriate course of action. He looked at Julia and Carl one last time, his eyes hardening. I hope you both understand the gravity of what you've done. With that, Henry stood, signaling that the meeting was over. Sarah nodded, standing up as well, and gestured for Julia and Carl to follow her out of the office. They walked silently down the hallway, the tension between them palpable. Once they reached the conference room, Sarah closed the door behind them and turned to face the two employees. Her expression stern. Let me make one thing clear, Sarah began, her voice steady. What happened last night was unacceptable on every level. This company has always prided itself on its commitment to treating every guest with respect, regardless of their beliefs or backgrounds. What you both did was not only a violation of that principle, but it also put the entire reputation of this hotel at risk. She paused, letting her words sink in before continuing. Julia, your actions were completely out of line. You allowed your personal biases to interfere with your duties as a front desk clerk. Your job is to provide excellent customer service, not to pass judgment on guests based on their appearance or beliefs. Julia's eyes were downcast, her face flushed with embarrassment. She knew Sarah was right. She had let her emotions get the best of her, and now she was paying the price. Effective immediately, Julia, you are terminated from your position, Sarah said, her tone firm but not unkind. Your actions violated company policy, and there is no place for that kind of behavior in this organization. Julia's head snapped up, her eyes wide with shock. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. Instead, she nodded slowly, tears beginning to well up in her eyes. She knew there was no point in arguing. She had made a mistake, and now she had to face the consequences. Sarah then turned her attention to Carl, who had been standing silently, his face pale. Carl, as the manager on duty, it was your responsibility to handle the situation professionally. Instead, you chose to support Julia's actions without considering the broader implications. You failed to lead, and you failed to uphold the values of this company. Carl swallowed hard, his eyes meeting Sarah's. I understand, he said quietly, his voice filled with regret. I should have handled it differently. I let my team down, and I let the company down. Sarah nodded, her expression softening slightly. I appreciate that you're taking responsibility, Carl. Given your history with the company, I'm going to give you a choice. You can either resign, or you can face a formal investigation that will likely lead to your termination. Carl's shoulders sagged, and he took a deep breath. I'll resign, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. He knew that an investigation would only prolong the inevitable, and he didn't want to drag the company through that process. Very well, Sarah said. I'll need your formal resignation by the end of the day. With that, the meeting was over. Julia and Carl left the conference room, their faces pale and their expressions somber. They had both made serious mistakes, and now they were paying the price. The consequences were harsh, but they were necessary to uphold the standards that Henry had built his company on. Sarah watched them leave, a sense of disappointment washing over her. She knew that this was a difficult situation for everyone involved, but it was also a necessary one. The values of the company had to be upheld, and there was no room for compromise when it came to treating guests with respect. Once Julia and Carl were gone, Sarah took a moment to collect herself before heading back to her office. She had a lot of work to do. This incident had highlighted some serious gaps in the training and oversight of the hotel staff, and she was determined to address them. She knew that Henry expected nothing less than excellence, and it was her job to ensure that the entire team lived up to those expectations. The following day, Sarah called a meeting with the hotel's department heads. She knew that this incident needed to be addressed head-on, not only to prevent something like it from happening again, but also to rebuild the trust that had been damaged. The department heads gathered in the conference room, their expressions a mix of concern and curiosity. They had all heard about what had happened, and they were eager to understand what changes would be made. Sarah stood at the front of the room, her expression serious. Good morning, everyone, she began, her voice steady. As you're all aware, we had a very serious incident occur at the hotel a few days ago. A guest was refused service because of a personal bias held by a member of our staff. This is completely unacceptable and goes against everything we stand for as a company. She paused, letting her words sink in before continuing. Effective immediately, we will be implementing new training programs for all staff members, focusing on professionalism, impartiality, and customer service excellence. It is crucial that every guest who walks through our doors feels welcomed and respected, regardless of their beliefs or backgrounds. Sarah then outlined the new training initiatives. There would be mandatory workshops on implicit bias, designed to help staff recognize and address their own prejudices. There would also be refresher courses on the company's core values and expectations for guest service, ensuring that everyone was on the same page when it came to providing a consistent and respectful experience for all guests. I want to make it clear that this is not optional, Sarah said, her tone firm. Every staff member, from management to frontline employees, will be required to participate in this training. We cannot afford to let personal opinions dictate how we treat our guests. This is a wake-up call for all of us, and we need to take it seriously. The department heads nodded in agreement, their expressions reflecting the gravity of the situation. They understood the importance of what Sarah was saying, and they were committed to making the necessary changes. The reputation of the hotel and the entire company depended on it. As the meeting concluded, Sarah felt a sense of resolve. This was a difficult moment for the hotel, but it was also an opportunity to grow and improve. She knew that Henry was counting on her to lead the team through this, and she was determined to rise to the challenge. Over the next few weeks, the new training programs were rolled out across the hotel. Staff members attended workshops and seminars, learning about the importance of professionalism and impartiality. There were discussions about the impact of personal biases and how they could affect guest experiences, as well as practical exercises to help employees develop better communication and conflict resolution skills. Sarah made it a point to be present at many of these training sessions, observing the staff's reactions and participating in the discussions. She wanted to lead by example, showing that this was not just a box to be checked, but a genuine effort to create a better environment for both guests and employees. The changes weren't easy for everyone. Some staff members struggled with the idea of confronting their own biases, while others were resistant to the notion that they needed additional training. But Sarah was patient, and she made it clear that this was not about punishment. It was about growth. The goal was to ensure that every guest felt valued and respected, and that required a commitment from every single member of the team. As the training programs progressed, Sarah began to see a shift in the hotel's atmosphere. There was a renewed focus on customer service, a sense of pride in the work that they were doing. Staff members were more attentive, more thoughtful in their interactions with guests. The incident with Henry had been a wake-up call, and it had sparked a change that was beginning to take root. Sarah knew that there was still work to be done, but she was hopeful. The hotel was moving in the right direction, and she was determined to ensure that they never lost sight of the values that Henry had built the company on. This was a moment of reflection and growth, and she was committed to making the most of it. As the weeks passed, the changes at the hotel began to take effect. The training programs that Sarah had implemented were well underway, and the staff was adjusting to the new standards of professionalism and impartiality. The incident with Henry Bennett had served as a turning point, a catalyst for growth that no one in the hotel could ignore. Despite the progress, the impact of what had happened still lingered, and for some, there were loose ends that needed to be tied up. One afternoon, Sarah received an email from Julia. It was a message that surprised her, an apology letter addressed to Henry Bennett himself. Julia had written it from the heart, and Sarah could see the genuine remorse in her words. Julia admitted her mistake and expressed her deep regret for allowing her biases to cloud her judgment. She acknowledged that she had let the company down, but most importantly, she recognized that she had let herself down. "Dear Mr. Bennett," the email began, "I want to sincerely apologize for my actions. I allowed my personal opinions to affect my professionalism, and I deeply regret the way I treated you. I understand now that my behavior was not only wrong but also hurtful, and I hope you can find it in your heart to forgive me. I am truly sorry for the harm I caused, and I am committed to learning from this experience." Sarah read through the email, her expression softening. It was clear that Julia had taken the time to reflect on her actions, and she genuinely wanted to make amends. Sarah forwarded the email to Henry, knowing that it was up to him to decide how he wanted to respond. A few days later, Henry sat in his office reading Julia's email. He could see the sincerity in her words, and it gave him a sense of closure. He had been disappointed by her actions, but he also believed in giving people a chance to learn from their mistakes. Henry decided to respond, keeping his message brief but compassionate. "Julia," he wrote, "thank you for your apology. I appreciate your willingness to take responsibility for your actions, and I hope this experience has taught you an important lesson. We all make mistakes. It's how we learn from them that truly matters. I wish you the best in your future endeavors." With that, Henry sent the email, feeling a sense of resolution. He knew that Julia's journey was far from over, but he was hopeful that this experience would lead her to become a better version of herself. Meanwhile, Carl had also been reflecting on his actions. Unlike Julia, Carl had chosen to meet with Henry in person. He reached out to Sarah, requesting a meeting with Henry to apologize directly. Sarah arranged the meeting, and a few days later, Carl found himself standing outside Henry's office, a mixture of anxiety and determination coursing through him. When Henry invited him in, Carl entered the office, his posture slightly hunched, his expression contrite. He took a deep breath before speaking, his voice steady but tinged with regret. "Mr. Bennett, I want to thank you for agreeing to meet with me," he began. "I know that my actions were inexcusable, and I want to apologize to you directly. I failed to lead, and I failed to uphold the values that this company stands for. I let my team down, and I let you down. I am truly sorry." Henry listened quietly, his expression thoughtful. He could see the sincerity in Carl's eyes, the regret that was evident in his voice. When Carl finished speaking, Henry nodded, his tone calm. "Thank you for coming to me, Carl," he said. "It takes courage to admit when you've made a mistake, especially one as serious as this. What matters now is that you learn from this experience and use it to grow." Carl nodded, a sense of relief washing over him. "I promise you, Mr. Bennett, I will do everything I can to become a better leader. I've learned a lot from this, and I hope to use it to make positive changes in the future." Henry extended his hand, and Carl shook it, the gesture a symbol of forgiveness and a chance for a new beginning. "I appreciate that, Carl," Henry said. "We all have moments where we fall short, but it's what we do afterward that defines us. I hope you take this experience and use it to become the leader I know you can be." After Carl left, Henry sat back in his chair, a sense of closure settling over him. The incident had been a difficult one, but it had also been an opportunity to reinforce the values that he had built his company on. It had been a chance to remind his staff and himself of the importance of treating every guest with dignity and respect, regardless of personal beliefs. Henry's reflection on the entire situation brought him a sense of clarity. He knew that the actions he had taken were necessary, not just for the sake of the company's reputation, but for the culture he wanted to cultivate within his business. This was about more than just one incident. It was about setting a standard, about making sure that every person who worked for him understood the values that were at the core of his company. He thought back to the day he had walked into the hotel lobby, dressed casually and wearing the hat that had sparked the entire incident. He hadn't intended to cause a stir. He had simply wanted to see how his staff treated their guests when they didn't know who he was. What he had found was disappointing, but it had also been a wake-up call, a reminder that there was still work to be done. Henry stood and walked over to the window, looking out at the city below. He felt a sense of hope, a belief that the changes Sarah had implemented would make a difference. The training programs, the workshops, the renewed focus on customer service. All of it was a step in the right direction. It wouldn't happen overnight, but he was confident that the culture of his hotels would continue to grow and improve. As he stood there, Henry couldn't help but feel grateful. Grateful for the opportunity to address the issues that had come to light, grateful for the chance to reinforce the values that mattered most to him, and grateful for the people who were willing to learn and grow. This incident had been a challenge, but it had also been a chance to make things better, and for that, he was thankful. With the changes taking root, the hotel began to find its rhythm once again. The staff was more mindful in their interactions, the atmosphere was more welcoming, and there was a noticeable shift in the way people approached their work. The incident with Henry had not only led to necessary consequences for those involved, but had also sparked an opportunity for genuine transformation. The values of respect, impartiality, and professionalism were at the forefront, and that was exactly what Henry had envisioned. Henry knew that these changes would not be instantaneous. Changing a culture took time, effort, and commitment. However, he was proud of the strides that the hotel had made. Sarah had done an exceptional job of implementing the training programs and overseeing the transition, and Henry had made it a point to commend her for her leadership. The lessons learned from this experience were not just for the hotel's employees, but for everyone in the company, including Henry himself. Several weeks later, Henry decided it was time to make another visit to the hotel. This time, he left the MAGA hat at home. He wanted to see if the changes were truly taking hold, and he wanted to experience the service as just another guest. As he walked into the hotel lobby, he was greeted by the front desk clerk, a young man named Ben. Ben smiled warmly, his demeanor friendly and professional. "Good afternoon, sir. Welcome to our hotel," Ben said. "Do you have a reservation with us today?" Henry nodded, giving his name. Ben quickly located the reservation and proceeded with the check-in process, his tone polite and attentive. There was no hint of judgment, no dismissive attitude, just genuine hospitality. Henry could see that the training had made an impact, and it filled him with a sense of satisfaction. As Ben handed Henry his room key, he added, "If there's anything you need during your stay, please don't hesitate to let us know. We want to make sure you have a wonderful experience." Henry smiled, taking the key. "Thank you, Ben. I appreciate that," he said. He looked around the lobby, noticing the small details that made a difference. The concierge assisting a family with their bags, the bellhop greeting a guest with a smile, the front desk staff working together seamlessly. It was exactly what he had hoped for. Later that evening, Henry sat in his room reflecting on the journey the hotel had been through. It had taken a difficult situation to bring about these changes, but he was proud of how his team had risen to the challenge. The staff had learned valuable lessons about the importance of treating every guest with dignity and respect, regardless of their personal beliefs. It was a lesson that went beyond the hotel industry. It was about humanity, about understanding that every person deserved to be treated with kindness. A few days later, Sarah invited Henry to a staff meeting to celebrate the progress they had made. Henry accepted, wanting to show his appreciation to the team for their efforts. The meeting was held in one of the hotel's conference rooms, and the atmosphere was filled with a sense of accomplishment. The staff members were eager to share their experiences, their challenges, and the growth they had experienced over the past few weeks. Sarah stood at the front of the room, her expression proud as she addressed the team. "I want to thank each and every one of you for your hard work and dedication," she began. "The changes we've made weren't easy, but they were necessary, and I'm so proud of how everyone has stepped up. This is what it means to be a part of this company, to learn, to grow, and to always strive for excellence." She then turned to Henry, inviting him to say a few words. Henry stood, his gaze sweeping across the room, taking in the faces of the people who had worked so hard to make things right. "Thank you, Sarah," he said, his voice steady. "I want to echo what Sarah has said. You've all done an incredible job. The changes we've made are not just about policies or procedures. They're about the way we treat people, about the respect we show to every guest who walks through our doors." He paused, his tone sincere. "We all make mistakes, but what matters most is how we respond to those mistakes. I've seen the effort you've put in to make this hotel a place where everyone feels welcome, and I couldn't be prouder. Let's continue to build on this foundation to make this hotel the best it can be. Thank you all for your hard work and dedication." The room erupted in applause, the staff members beaming with pride. It was a moment of unity, a testament to the resilience and determination of the team. As the meeting concluded, Henry took a moment to speak individually with some of the staff members, thanking them personally for their contributions. It was clear to him that the culture of the hotel had shifted, and it was headed in the right direction. Before leaving the hotel that day, Henry took a moment to speak with Sarah privately. "You've done an incredible job, Sarah," he said, his tone filled with gratitude. "I couldn't have asked for a better person to lead this effort. Thank you for everything." Sarah smiled, her eyes reflecting the pride she felt in her team. "Thank you, Henry. It's been a challenge, but it's also been incredibly rewarding. I'm just glad we were able to make a difference." As Henry left the hotel, he felt a sense of peace. The incident that had sparked all of this had been unfortunate, but it had also been a turning point, a chance to make things better, to reinforce the values that mattered most to him. The hotel was in good hands, and Henry knew that the lessons learned would continue to shape the future of the company. Before we wrap up, let us know, what would you have done if you were in Henry's shoes? Have you ever faced a situation where you had to stand up for what was right, even when it was difficult? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell for more inspiring tales of leadership and growth.